Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to Means of Grace. I'm Melissa McGill, the Conference Director of Communications. In this episode, Bishop Ken Carter has a conversation with Kate Bowler. Kate is a New York Times bestselling author, a Duke University professor, and an incurable optimist. They'll discuss her book, No Cure for Being Human, and Other Truths I Needed to Hear, which was written after Kate was unexpectedly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at age 35. I hope you'll enjoy their impactful conversation.
My name is Ken Carter. I serve as the Bishop of the Florida and Western North Carolina Conferences of the United Methodist Church, and also have a relationship with Duke Divinity School where I teach very occasionally with students there and appreciate that role. As we gather, I want to thank Shannon Redden and Reverend Alex Shanks from the Episcopal Office here in Florida. I'm in Lakeland, Florida today, where it's sunny and maybe looks like it's about to rain. But we're grateful for you and for your engagement with us this morning. I wanted to introduce our guest, and this will be a conversation. We have wanted to offer 3 conversations during this winter and spring. The first was a conversation between Bishop Gregory Palmer and Dr. Willie Jennings on racism. The second was a conversation with Dr. Todd Bolsinger on resilience. And the third is a conversation today with Dr. Kate Bowler about what it means to be human. And it is based upon her book, No Cure for Being Human. And I hope you've had an opportunity to begin to read this book. We thank Kate for the gift of her time with us today. She's very much in demand, and we consider it a great gift that she's with us. Dr. Bowler is on the faculty of Duke Divinity School, where she teaches the history of Christian thought. She is the author of Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, and more recently, No Cure for Being Human. This will form the basis for our conversation, and this is the book, No Cure for Being Human. Her voice has been heard in the New York Times, the Washington Post, on NPR, and her writing has been celebrated by persons like Adam Grant and Glennon Doyle and Anne Lamott. She's married to Tobin, and they have a son, Zach, and we're just very grateful, Kate, for your being with us. And this will be a conversation, and I will really get out of the way here. I wanted to just read one verse of a psalm, which really came to me as I read Kate's book and as I often hear her voice. And this is from Psalm 90, verse 12. Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. And this, I believe, is the gift Kate brings to us.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much to your staff for organizing. And I love being on Team Methodist. So to be on a call with 222 of our incredible, exhausted, wonderful, fearless leaders is a real honor for me. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we'll go right into it. You teach at Duke, and you have really, as a historian, delved into the sphere of the self-help movement in all of its manifestations. And you've sort of become an expert in the cliches that we sometimes find ourselves saying and we want to believe, and maybe that's not so good. What are some of the common formulas people try to construct in order to live, and why are they so compelling?
Oh, yeah, we love those little pocket-sized aphorisms. And I think we love them because so often they're a quarter turn away from something that feels very true and often very precious about God, but manages to make it so formulaic and so convenient that it's no longer quite true anymore. Like that God is always closing windows or opening windows and closing doors. It's unclear, but very, very interested in our egress and exit strategies. A lot of everything happens for a reason. Look on the bright side. There's, the more sort of tragedy specific, God needed an angel, ways of so often reaching into unexplainable tragedy and offering a bright-sided solution. I was really an expert in sort of just one of them in fact, and Floridians, I am sorry, I promise to revisit Florida when I'm not just visiting prosperity megachurches or religious theme parks, but like so much of what I studied for my book, Blessed, A History of the Prosperity Gospel, that was what took me to your parts. It was ways of people wondering if they put themselves in the right place at the right time and they could feel that kind of sunshine of God's favor, that they could declare themselves #blessed. So I think from the moment I became obsessed with the prosperity gospel and #blessed to now looking at different sort of self-help strategies for how we spend our time, in all of them, I have found like very interesting Christian debates and an opportunity for us as people who love to serve others, for us to figure out how these popular scripts don't serve us well in those moments.
At age 35, and you write about this publicly, you were given this grim prognosis, stage 4 cancer. And in your writing, you say that what you once thought were moments became minutes. And a lot of your reflection is about time. What do you mean by that? And how have you come to understand time differently?
Well, I guess please understand how absurd I am. Like from the very beginning, all I really wanted to be was a historian. My dad's a historian. I grew up in the beautiful Stalin-esque architecture of the University of Manitoba, just perched on the Red River with every building with no windows. And yet my parents were so overwhelmed with a sense of service. They loved to teach. And so all I wanted to do was this. And so when I finally had a minute there in my early 30s where my life came together for a hot minute after years of infertility, I finally had this little baby and I had my dream job at Duke. So many gargoyles at Duke. I was thrilled. It was the first job I ever got. I felt so lucky. And also I felt some strange combination of gratitude, but also pride that my life had worked out. I think maybe some of that is just the sort of lure of eternal youth when you're in a stage of your life in which you get to feel the pleasure of trying, of sheer effort and wondering if it'll pay off. And then it unraveled so quickly that spiritually, I almost just didn't know what to say about it other than that I was devastated, that I went from being healthy and imagining, no cancer in my family, imagining that I had the rest of my life, to suddenly feeling locked into that sort of day, that week, that year. It was September when I was diagnosed and I was supposed to die that June. So I got really spiritually interested in what we say about time and whether or not it's sufficient for us to live in the moment as every mindfulness guide wants to, or very angry with well-meaning Christians, bless them, that declare that heaven would then be the solution to that much tragedy, as if you pour yourself into a future that it'll spill backwards and make up for the present, which of course it doesn't. So I got really invested in how we talk about enoughness in our life, and whether, if you can't have enough time, how you measure what spiritual enoughness feels like.
Oh, I appreciate that. As I read No Cure for Being Human, it helps me to be in touch with a number of really important concepts. And one is just limitation. And another is kind of finitude. Another is being truthful. And I think what people really appreciate about you is the willingness to be, as we would say, a truth teller, and just the complexity of experiences and roles. And so a part of the book that's really compelling, and I think would really speak to a lot of people listening, is the part of the book, and it appears several times, where you are navigating this illness and domestic life and your calling and preparation to be a teacher and a scholar, and the decisions you make and how gender relates to that. What did all of this help you to understand, and about your vocation and your calling amidst everything that's happening in your life?
Yeah, vocation has always been such a tricky thing for me because so often, like all forms of idolatry, it looks so close to altruism. Aren't I just, this is a calling. It has nothing to do with my ambition, Bishop. Don't look too closely. Until that time, my ambition and my calling had so closely overlapped that I was able to say that all the effort I was pouring into my career was also in service of something more than myself. So then it was it was sort of like the opposite of the lottery question. Like, if you had $1 million, would you quit your job tomorrow kind of feeling? Mine was like, what if you had $0? Would you keep doing your hilariously time expensive job? And I was in a strange situation where it's the fall, I'm supposed to die in the summer. And I thought all at once, maybe I haven't spent my life. Maybe I've overspent in a career that cost me too much. And at that time, and for so many women in academia, it cost me years of like a window for fertility, the ability to have kids without having such a ridiculous set of tenure requirements. I had been on the treadmill for so long. I had imagined that when I start living my life, I could squeeze it into a smaller window. And then when that window was less than a year, and I would somehow have to write an entirely new book of massive research, original groundbreaking research, a lot of spreadsheets, which normally takes about 5 years, instead of maybe quitting things to spend time with my family. I'll never forget the sort of question of then, what is my life for? What if I've overspent? And it was the lovely and adorable, I'm sure many of you know him, Will Willimon. Will's right across my hallway. And if you know Will, you know he's very opinionated. And he just wanders in my office a lot while talking. And he wandered in one day and I was absolutely devastated because a friend of mine had died in his medical residency in his late 30s. And I could tell that he knew he'd overspent. And the question then was, well, how will I know if I've overspent? And Will paused for a long time because I said, well, isn't this kind of getting out of control? Me gesturing to like 1,700 books about American religion. He said, well, I suppose that depends if it's a job or a calling. And I thought about that a lot over the next few months when I was in chemotherapy infusion rooms and wondering what we do, as Ann Patchett would say, like with our precious days. And I slowly came to realize that the great gift of, for me, academia, and for so many others, service to the church is, yes, it is exhausting. And yes, it can be far too many emails, but there is a sense of the beauty and dignity of purpose that can just sing to us. And that instead of being sort of professionally cancerous all year, that if, as my friend said, maybe if the worst happens, they, as in the people who love me, can still find me there, like in the work that I do. What a lovely way of maybe reframing a question about cost to maybe a question about gift. And that if I maybe learned to. So I decided to finish my dumb book and handed it in the day before a life-threatening surgery because in the act of doing, I felt, that feeling like you get a second to feel God's pleasure, and yours in being good at something, even if it was only a book that I think roughly 250 people read. I know vocation is a tricky language because sometimes it feels like then we're never given permission to stop trying. But in moments of real pain, I have found vocation to be given back to me as a feeling of non-instrumental joy, just for no reason except that it is good.
Yeah. We haven't talked about this, but one of my teachers in graduate school was, and I just made this connection as I've been reading your book, was Carlos Aker, the historian. And he was, I think, a scholar. I had him for a class in Calvin, seminar in Calvin, graduate seminar, but he was a scholar of medieval and Reformation Christianity. And then he had a life experience where he wrote a book called Waiting for Snow in Havana, which was about his Cuban boyhood and how that all came to the surface. And he told me one time that he had spent 10 years of his life writing 2 academic books that he described how the number of people he thought had actually read them. And it was a depressingly small number of people. And then this book just came out of him, this Waiting for Snow in Havana. Yeah. And I went to see him read one time, and there were literally hundreds of people who could not get close enough to his story. And so just to follow up to the question about vocation and calling, obviously God has called you into something that is really extraordinary, in this time of the writing you are doing now. And I believe it's a both and. I don't divorce the academic world from the quote, the world we live in. So what would you say about how this calling, including kind of what we're doing now, where you're speaking to several hundred people, and what's this calling, emergent calling, mean to you? And why do you think it resonates with people?
I think we're all doing the same thing, which is that we have invested in terrible math. I mean, God is just awful calculus, right? If you take the popular cliches about how we should live, we shouldn't be doing this. We should be. There's a yoga class people need to be. There's a beach spa to be gotten. I mean, this, like, the desire to pour ourselves into the community of God's beloved and the fragile and the weak and the work of justice in the world is terrible. It's a terrible investment. And I think that's why the dismantling of formulas about what I thought my life was going to be for, and the study of all of the time management cliches about how to create enoughness has been such a beautiful reminder for me to return to the gift and the cost, which will never add up in the way that the world hopes it will. And most of it will not look good from the outside. I mean, Instagram will never be able to appropriately capture the work of these churches, the things we do in a day. I guess I just find the public ministry part to be part of the joyful irony of all of this. Is that the more I say, like, Instagram is a very complicated place to be a spiritual person, the more I find myself saying that on Instagram. I think that's part of the absurdity of these moments, in writing about Blessed, and then having to explain that very few of us will get the experience of winning in a world that doesn't count what we do as wins. In light of that, I think vocation is going to be the most fruitful and the most complicated math that we parse about the way that we feel alive by our love, lit up by these, and also endlessly wearied by the needs that are presented to us. Yeah. It always just brings me back to terrible, terrible math. Uninstrumentalizable God,
Yeah. And that's really intriguing to think about vocation and how we invest our finite life in the way that we're called to. This past weekend, I preached in a church, and the church has had 2 clergy women as pastors over about a 16-year period. It's a wonderful church. And both of them have had very serious health challenges, about which have been public. And you write about your experience, I think, which is why you have such a profound, as you say, public ministry with people. And a thread that kind of runs through No Cure for Being Human is the concept of fear. Fear of what is lost, fear of what won't be experienced. But I want you to talk about that. And I think many people who are listening today have lived there, are living there. What are you learning about being afraid?
Yeah. I mean, for about 2 years, I was terrified all the time, because for the first 2 years, life was so delicate and such a crisis. And I spent so much time in the hospital that it was hard not to feel like I was at the edge of a cliff and my toes were curled over the edge. But then after, cancer and life sort of became a chronic condition, and I get to sort of take a couple steps back and see the edge, but I don't have to live there all the time. And I think learning to live there, put up my tent there, has probably been, I think fear has probably been the thing I've been trying to grapple with the most. Partly because the question, will I ever stop having to be afraid, is not really one that anyone can answer. And also one that I feel like has been most kind of pathologized and demonized in Christian language. I mean, perfect love drives out fear. That somehow a supremely confident, faith-filled person won't be nearly as afraid. And so I've been trying to develop a more comfortable spiritual relationship with fear. Maybe fear, just like grief is the language of love, that fear is also a language of of love. It shows me what I am terrified that I would have to live without. And then I need to right size my relationship with fear. I always want, this is why sometimes just work has been great for me, but I'm trying to shrink it to the size that it needs to take up, because it does need to take up space. I still need to do terrifying things. And it's nuts. It's just nuts when Christians, she said lovingly, try to tell me that a better person wouldn't be afraid. I think God loves our honesty, because without honesty, we can't have courage. And without courage, we can't have hope. So I feel like if I want to be a deeply hopeful person who believes that God will dry every tear and save the world, then I need to be someone who has like a better account of fear.
Yeah. You reflect in the book on humanity and how that sometimes clashes with how the culture understands the body, and why this is compelling, especially for women. And I'd love for you to reflect on that in however way you would like to.
Yeah, well, that was probably my most embarrassing chapter, because I had the feeling that somewhere out there, my academic advisor was reading it, and here was me just sort of going on about how, and fear is a perfect way to frame it. If anyone's bought like The Body, I don't think anyone's read The Body Keeps the Score. It was like the most popular book on the bestseller list for the last couple of years. It's this big, and I really doubt most people have bought it. But the sort of part of the way that we're coming to understand the nature of trauma and embodied fear is that it is hard for us to return to God's goodness in our own selves, that sometimes the harder things and longer and more fractured life gets, the more we feel alienated from being able to say that our bodies are somehow good. I struggled a lot with that because I had my body carved up so many times that I am currently on my ninth belly button. And this is genuinely my least favorite one. And so I think in coming to terms with how do we live our chronic lives where so often we're in a before and an after, and our bodies tell the story of the after. And our culture loves to celebrate only the bodies that look about 14 and untouched by the ravages of the world. That's somewhere in there that I'll have to accept that our bodies are stories about how we have lived, the things done to us, the things we can't change. That's been maybe my least comfortable. But Barbara Brown Taylor says something, I can't believe I'm saying this to you, Bishop, but it just is sort of the perfect spiritual comment. But Barbara Brown Taylor, she says, sometimes you just have to stand in front of the mirror and take off all your clothes and say, this body is God's home address. I thought that was very spicy.
We'll
and what's your follow-up comment to that? It's just curious.
I think I may ask us to use a different part of our brain here. Maybe that's my follow-up. So this was a question, and I hear in your voice and writing, it's sort of underneath it, a kind of love of the tradition, even with its flaws and frailties. You are a historian of Christian thought. A part of the math is you did navigate divinity school at Yale, a PhD at Duke in church history. And you've written a book about being human. And that's something pastors and church leaders don't maybe talk enough about. So just a question, just for a moment, just using a different part of your brain. How could we have a more faithful understanding of, from a Christian point of view, what it means to be human? And why is that important right now?
I think we have such a deeply countercultural, gorgeous witness to finitude that nobody is going to want to hear. This is just this is not going to be, nobody's going to want to hear it, but it is true. We believe that sin and suffering and death are ultimately solved by the love of God. But that finitude is something that we're going to have to, that we recognize as being part of being a person. If you look at it sounds silly to say, but if you look at the airport kiosks, you're going to see 20 books that will try to explain health optimization to you in language that suggests that the trajectory of what it really means to be a human is anti-aging, increasing life, that we should be able to move toward greater, that winning is a rejection of our mortality. And the Christian tradition has, in our suffering Christ, a very powerful account of God's not rejection of our humanity, but radical, fully permeated, united in the person of Jesus Christ account of being with us in our frailty. I think at first, because I was, sick and dying, I thought I was writing about time. And I realized, no, I think what our message is truly that there need be no shame in our finitude, enoughness in the fact that we have seasons of independence and then back to dependence. Interdependence is the way we were made. I think, again, Dr. Oz is going to run for Senate and nobody is going to like our non-health optimization. We're going to be against optimizing our kids. We're going to have powerful things to say in this pretty terrifying future of what people imagine, how much we imagine we can tinker with our genetics. We are going to say that we are, even in our frailty and in our endings, that God declares that good.
Thank you. I want to explore 2 or 3 more questions, and then I want to invite everyone who's with us, if you would begin to place questions in the Q&A, and we'll get there in a few minutes, and we certainly want that part, the last sort of part of our time, to be there. Yeah. So just 2 or 3 questions here at the end of our conversation. And again, thank you, Kate. This was a question that came to me, and I love the way it's framed. And it's helping us to move into hope and what hope means. Hope, not a cliche, but what hope means in the midst of what you are living and writing about, and others are whose voices you surface in the book. And hope can often feel shallow or not helpful. But what does hope look like when it is not tethered to infinity? What does it mean when hope and finitude are together?
Yeah, because I think and this is in the work I've done on the history of positive thinking, is so often hope is imagined in our culture as a false resilience, as an obsession with an optimism that imagines no limits. So when people say I'm hopeful, they often just mean I will place no limits on my expectations, no matter what. No matter what the reality of our bodies are. I mean, because part of our story about hope is always a story about infinity, insofar as we believe God stands outside of time and tells the story about us, regardless of the days. Then so are the days of our lives. But for me, the story that separates hope from optimism is that I believe that God makes our days and our lives beautiful and rich and meaningful and filled with truth, but guarantees me that my ending is not the ending of the story. And so ultimately, the hopeful piece is that I will always, I hope, end up being part of a story that God tells, but that will be different from the formulaic version that my life will inherently work out.
Yeah. I would encourage those listening to know more about your podcast, which is Everything Happens. You have conversations with some pretty remarkable people about hope and about meaning in the midst of the tragic, about beauty in unconventional ways. And you've gained, again, a great audience. This is part of the public ministry. What surprised you about the people who continue to sit with you in that space?
Yeah, because that podcast was sort of my solution to being unbearably lonely after I got sick. I felt like I was the person who was terrible at parties, who's always always saying deeply uncomfortable things. And I didn't want to revert to our media's obsession with lessons, that people who are suffering are really there to just offer us perspective on our lives. The 2 primary audiences we have for each episode, and we call them sad NPR because they're kind, smart, and funny. But they're often someone who's gone through a before and an after in their life, or pastors, doctors, social workers, people who care for those. And I think the sense that we are all wrapped up in a deep desire to know what is true, to feel the weight of our hardest thoughts, and then also to have enough joy and silliness and connection to sustain that life. So that's the sort of life as a chronic condition feeling I think that everybody needs. That's been really lovely to hear because I feel like what every podcast episode does for me, this is why I do it, is there's a moment there where I'm surprised every time. Like someone has just said something so bananas insightful, or like a turn of phrase that I couldn't have conjured, that the gift of language then becomes a thing that can carry our community. Like early on when I was very sick and I felt lonely, and someone called people like us the fellowship of the afflicted. That phrase, when I know that somebody knows that life is hard and weight settles in our eyes, I can see it now. I wouldn't have seen it before that little phrase. It's the gift of Christian theology, is that it offers us the language that can bear the weight of our lives.
Thank you. Thank you. And so a very accomplished friend of mine said, what I learned in COVID is I'm not in control of things. Many of us had plans for that year, for the next year, and all of those plans got disrupted. And even those who felt like they had a lot of control, who felt invincible maybe, began to experience limitations. And so reflect on your memoir and what it can offer to people for whom life has just been upended in a number of ways.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like delighted about this. Sometimes I just am sort of glad to have the company, but the feeling is just of like what Dorothy Day would call precarity, right? That we feel the contingency of our lives. There's a wonderful book by Reinhold Niebuhr that you can stack up right next to Dorothy Day's. At the same time, they both use the term precarity, but Reinhold, bless him, refers to it as a state to be overcome, as if we just want to get to the after time, because the feeling delicate, the feeling like everything comes undone all the time feels like the thing we just have to muscle through. But Dorothy says it is a state of being. And once you can settle there spiritually for a minute, you can see the world more clearly. And you can see that it becomes the, Leonard Cohen style, the cracks for which the light shines through. And I think that's been the awful, terrible gift of precarity, is that we know things now we can't unknow. We keep that as as part of the upside down kingdom. I think it will continue, even when we're back to feeling invincible, it will serve us when we walk into those hospital rooms or we reach for somebody's hand, that we do know in our bones what it's like to come undone.
Thank you, Kate. And thank you for No Cure for Being Human. I hope those listening, many of you I know are deeply engaged with it. And I'll just say, I said this to you a little earlier, the experience you described where you are visited by a pastor in a hospital room, I thought was a profound moment. I just give thanks I was a pastor of local churches for 28 years and was often on one side of those experiences. I, through a health crisis, have been on the other side of that, was a few years ago, and just want to honor the pastors for whom that's a part of their labor. Those of you, when you read the book, you will come across this scene, and I hope it will just resonate with you as you've given that kind of gift to people. So thank you for the way you experienced that, but also the way you remembered it, and then the way you shared it with us. So thank you. So Alex, let's move now to the last few minutes of the conversation, and we want to begin to take up the questions. Alex, if you would simply read them and Kate can respond to them. And then Kate is going to have, I believe.
Yeah. Do you mind if I bless us at the end?
That would be wonderful. So we'll move in that direction.
The first question is just an update on how you're doing health-wise.
Yeah. I'm doing much better than I was. I just still have to be pretty carefully monitored, and I have to meet pretty regularly with doctors about I'm kind of like, if you see the Smokey the Bear thing, I'm not at like red anymore. I'm sort of where yellow hits orange. So I will accept any and all prayers for health, because I'm always pretty delicate.
Now, the next question just says they appreciated your critique of the cliches, but one of the interesting things they have found is how people seem to actually find comfort in those phrases, even though they're theologically wrong. So how do you balance that?
Yeah. And some of them might not entirely be theologically wrong too. We might just disagree with them. For instance, someone with a very strong articulation of God's sovereignty might take a great deal of comfort in the God has a plan language. And God has a plan for my suffering. God has a plan and purpose in every health challenge. I mean, I've met many people for whom feeling like it is a test that they have to overcome is something that I've experienced as a tremendous burden. But for others, they feel like God is in the details of this drama that they're in, and that they feel like then it also implies a promise that they won't be abandoned. So I try to approach those kinds of moments with a lot of, like, you don't want to Jenga it, where you take all the blocks from the bottom and you put it on top. And then you're like, hope it stands up. In almost every slightly incorrect thing is something kind of beautiful. Like, God needed an angel is a terrible thing to say. And also the feeling that God is holding your beloved is an experience of tremendous comfort. So I always go a little easy, kind of go in with the tweezers instead of the hammer.
Great. How do you see the role of representatives of faith in the process of ministering to folks who are at the edge of the cliff?
Wait, tell me more, Alex. What do you think they're asking about?
I think they're wondering, how do they, as a person of faith or a clergy person, how do they minister to people who are at the edge of the cliff?
Oh my gosh. Wow, you guys are great at it. Let me just say, you guys are my favorite. Everything, not knowing what to say and just reading the Psalms. There's some great, especially the ragey ones is my favorite. Have you left me alone? God, don't you love me? It feels good when people give you spiritual language for honesty. I love it when they just show up and put a hand on your shoulder and you get to see their little moon faces shining back at you when you feel like paper. I love it when they sing. I love it when they offer prayers that are embarrassing. Like, I don't want to assume where you're at, but I'd love to be able to pray for you in a way that you want me to go for gold and pray for a radical everything, or you want, like, how can I meet you where you're at? That's why I always prayed with Pentecostals when I was very sick, because they do not mind embarrassing themselves. And it's kind of my favorite. But mostly it's just the gift of non-pitying presence. I love that they look at me knowing that they know that they're not the answer. Pastors don't have to be the answer. They could just, the gift of presence is so, you know that they're not afraid of you. And that to me was the deepest kind of companionship. So thank you for all the ways that you do that.
This person wrote that the book has brought them to a place of tension between the crippling perfectionism in faith and the overly permissive, it's all good type of faith. Can you talk about that tension at all, and how our humanness and call towards perfection, as your Methodist friends love to claim, impacts our lives with God?
Yeah, I think that's referring to good enough, which is like such it's titled the book Good Enough, because we started to say it in a funny voice, like good enough, which is actually just pointing to the theological question at the heart of what is the role of agency in our lives? How changeable are we? I am a human bulldozer, so at all times I am trying for every possible change, but trying to come up with a more Christian account of our efforts when we live in a culture whose hyper agency actually can make us say theologically untrue things, that we are only good if we are maximizing our mornings and on a Peloton. And so I love to sort of, if we could disentangle our cultural expectation of perfection and then move back. The unpopular language that would be harder to put in a book is, it's really, we're just talking about sanctification, is how much can God chip away at our many vices and render our efforts more beautiful than they would be. I love Methodists. I love them so much. Having spent so much time with perfectionistic, like on the far end of agency Pentecostals, I have a little more theological room for our foibles, but I am certainly not reformed. So I'm always obsessed with the spiritual questions around trying. If I just might add a little just for Team Methodist, I think part of our struggle with this stuff, though, is that we're in such a strange moment for the church where we do need to, we're like talking about how to reinvent ourselves. We're forced into the discomfort of trying new forms of things. And I think we can do it, though, without taking on the sort of rhetoric of excellence that our business culture feeds us. I think we can be bulldozers that attempt new and ridiculous things, but I would just sort of hope to sort of guide us a little bit away from the business language that then infects prosperity megachurches, that we have to use corporate language to measure and talk about our efforts. That's just always my little worry. It's always my little worry for us.
Thanks. The next question says, how can we find and offer to others genuine, encouragement in God and Scripture during hard times without being cliched or shallow.
Yeah. Well, I always end up making like appendices at the back of every book to offer little, like, here's some stuff we might say instead, if you ever want any of those. But lots of it just to me sounds like at the moments of incredible crisis, when my sister said, "Oh, Kate, you are loved, you are loved, you are loved. You will not disappear. You are here." In our undoing, we feel abandoned. So just language of intense love. God is here. I am here. I don't think anything could be. It's like the book of Job, big promise. So what do we get when everything is stripped away? We are guaranteed God's presence. And so I wouldn't mind if that was said very loudly all the time.
Wonderful. This person writes, how can we help those around us understand that it's okay to experience and express feelings of sadness, fear, and heartbreak? Yeah. It's okay to feel these darker feelings. We don't need to cover them up. So how do you respond to someone that says, be positive, look to the brighter side?
Yeah, I think because they think you're doing you a favor if they just skip to the solutions part, then they'll have spared you all the pain of your discomfort, when really it becomes a double burden for us when we have to then deny the reality of our situation. So I like to say really hilariously obvious things like, I am upset because this is devastating. I'm tired because this is exhausting. I like to kind of return back to that, just sort of giving spiritual honesty some room to breathe, and then seek out the people who praise you for your honesty. And don't make you do that thing with your voice where you go, like where you say something true, like, wow, this is probably the worst day of my life. Everyone's had one, right? Shouldn't we be able to say that? But then we go, but I guess if this is tomorrow. Every time you hear your voice climbing, which is like, stop. You need the moment where you just let it land.
This person just writes that they've experienced when someone receives a difficult diagnosis that others try to explain why that may have happened, or why it won't happen to them. And they just wondered, how have you experienced this? And what thoughts do you have about how to respond to that?
Rage? Well, my early response was rage with that one, because I think it's a special kind of cruelty. I really do, to explain the suffering as they suffer in order to free ourselves from the burden of wondering if it could be us. I do think it is a awful cruelty. It is also so deeply natural that we want to, in our synthetic brains, return the world to right side up. So I have to admit, the reason why I wrote Everything Happens for a Reason, Other Lies I've Loved, was because I was so hurt and so mad. So if anyone feels hurt and mad, I am with you. Eventually now I can say things like, pain is terrifying. It's theologically and personally terrifying. So any response, usually the best kind, is to address the asterisk that goes beside our pain. Because in our pain, the questions are always, God, where are you? Will I have to do this forever? Am I alone in this? And then because the fear is, I can't live like this. So I think anything that addresses the asterisks around the pain is always, to me, like the great spiritual comfort, rather than promising to cure cancer. Unless someone knows how, then feel free to email me.
What things do you ground yourself in or come back to as you navigate feeling out of control?
Yeah, I bet you guys are so much better at this, though. Wish you could tell me. I mean, I think it sort of depends on where you are in that agency spectrum we were talking about, whether you're kind of the hyper agency or hyper passivity type. The hyper agency usually need to return to a contemplative spirituality, which they surrender. I bet we could do this by Enneagram numbers too, if anyone's secretly still into the Enneagram, which I am. But those in passivity often need to return to the sense that God is calling them and stoking them, and like that there are things in them that must be met by the challenge of the world. So for me, I'm on the not so activity side. So I always need to return to Benedictine kinds of things in which I am forced into the discipline of a peace that is not natural or efficient. Yeah.
Wonderful. This person writes, can you share more about how we navigate the space between doxology and lament and the prevalence of your best life in our culture and churches?
Yeah, what a phrase. You guys, we're 20 years into best life now. You know, that is a theology. The term was coined in 2004 by Joel Osteen. It is wild to think that we've had 20 years of imagining that the triumph of the wellness industry should be lived out in our everyday social media feeds. Yeah, there's such a deep unlearning we have to do, in which we have to say, God, you are at work and I won't always know it. God, I may not always be the advertisement for your promises. And in all things, let your will be done. And if you figure that out, let me know. I find that to be very tricky work. I was thinking about you all and the exhaustion that you all must be feeling right now. And I wondered if maybe the closing blessing could be on just how exhausting it is, if that sounds okay.
Right.
Also, if you could have a high tolerance for gentle sarcasm in the middle, I feel this is a spiritually safe place to do that. Okay, you ready? So if there's a joke, I promise it's an actual joke, not a mistake. I always feel like I have to say that if people worry that my voice sounds too pious. All right, here's a blessing for when caring costs you. Blessed are you who want your life to count, you who do all the right things, who hope it will add up to something. That is some good math. But blessed are you who do terrible, terrible math. You who care about strangers. What a waste. That wasn't going to get you a nicer apartment. You who give your health in service to people who might not even deserve it and who never say thank you. You could have been protecting yourself or, God forbid, sleeping through the night, but you are here instead. Blessed are you who listen to long, winding stories from lonely hearts instead of rushing off to more interesting friends. You picked boredom or loving strangers instead of the warmth of being known. That was your time and you're never going to get it back. Blessed are you who love people who aren't grateful, the sick who endanger your health, the deeply boring who know you have things to do. Loving people can be the most meaningful thing in the world, but can also be hard and scary and boring or disgusting or sad or anxiety-inducing with zero overtime. So, blessed are you, dear one, you who made these bad investments, those acts of love that are not going to add up to success in the world the way that the world sees it. You are the very definition of love. Bless you, my darlings. I really appreciate the fact that you carved out this time so I can be with your gorgeous leaders.
And we give thanks for you and thank you for this gift.
Team Methodist, guys. All right. We'll see you out there in the field.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.